Good morning, Marlyn. How are you?
Fine, thanks, Darren. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah. We met just before Christmas, didn't we?
We did, yes, after about 22 years of a gap.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we bumped into each other, I think, at the Fringe. I remember you came to see my show.
I did, yeah.
And then I bumped into a couple of, or maybe a friend or colleague of yours, or people who live up round your way. I went to some posh dinner. I was doing a keynote at a civil engineers thing. I had no right being at, to be honest. I just went because I thought my wife would love it. And one of the people there was like just going on and on about you. And I was thinking, I need to get back in touch with Marlyn. And then when I started thinking about this trauma campaign that I'm trying to do, I thought, well, who better to talk to about my trauma than the psychologist that had the hard burden of dealing with me right at the apex of my adolescent hell. So I just wanted to kind of start, for the benefit of the audience. Can you just give us a bit of insight into your background in terms of where you come from, how you became interested in this topic, and what your expertise is?
Okay, well, I'm from Dundee originally, from a working class background. I went to Dundee University in the late 60s and got a degree in psychology and history. But I was always been interested in what makes people tick, and I was interested in children. So I trained as a teacher and I worked in special ed for a couple of years in Glasgow. And then there was a shortage of psychologists, and I was taken on as an educational psychologist, and started my working life out in the East End, in Hag Hill area, and basically given a bunch of schools, secondary, feeder primaries, and referrals came in. And mostly at that time for educational psychologists, it was learning difficulties. But it became quite clear that really a lot of the learning difficulties were because the children weren't able to learn. It wasn't because they couldn't. There's a lot of IQ testing, which I didn't really like, but had to be done. That was just the ethos of the service. And then I kind of got interested in more in the behavioural problems, because there was a lot of them out in the East End, as you can imagine. And in adolescence in particular, in Cranhill Secondary, I ran a glue sniffing group. And when I used to go to the school, the kids would approach me and say, "Are you the glue sniffing woman?" Because they wanted to come to the group, because that my fame had spread from the boys that I saw. It was more boys, and it was the learning support teacher and myself. Friday afternoon, we were in a school, we had the hall, we did activities with them to try and keep them off the glue. And then that's why when I got into sort of thinking about addictions, because I thought, oh my God, they're starting and they're 13 and 14. Yeah. And then I thought, right, I really need to be thinking more along these lines, which was unusual at the time. But really, psychology at that time, there weren't huge rules. You could just be interested in what you were interested in and follow that, and that's what I did. Yeah,
and it's interesting, even there's just so much to kind of pick up in that sort of brief recollection, because the concepts and frameworks and ideas and labels and stigmas attached to many of the things back then have been revolutionised in many ways, but the same basic problem is at the root of a lot of the behaviour that we see as being challenging or problematic, where it pertains to children primarily from poorer backgrounds. Now, I'm also, viewers know I'm from a working class background, and I arrived at the Notre Dame Centre in Glasgow's West End when I was about 16 or 17 years old, and you were there, and we started work together. My mother had not long passed away. I was had been invited to leave the family home. Basically, just there was so much trauma erupting in all of us. We didn't know how to support each other in difficulty. And so I think I had been dealing with anger, and I had been dealing with, I remember describing it as like a ball of fire in my chest. And so then we kind of set out to explore what all this meant. I wonder if you could just tell me what your first impressions of me were in that early period where we were sort of getting to know each other.
Well, whenever you walked through the door and I started asking you these questions, I was amazed at the fact that you were so willing to answer them, because I dealt mostly with teenagers and mostly you could get a grunt out of them. They didn't come willingly. They were dragged there by whatever relative or whoever. And you were so different because you were actually saying, please help me. I'm in a bad state. And I thought, whoa, this is really good. And also you were extremely articulate for somebody of your age and had a lot of insight into, you know, why you were the way you were. So I thought that was a good start. I thought, this is good. I'm quite keen that I'll do something with this young man. And it went from there. And
we met, I think it was weekly, because I remember I would get out of school in a midweek afternoon, jump on the bus, and I always remember the journey because it was like out of rush hour hours. So go to Govan, jump on the subway, across the water, and I've written about this in Poverty Safari, and I've also like reconstructed it in television. The moment that a working class person from one of the rougher parts of Glasgow emerges onto Byres Road for the first time, there is a strange, pleasant sense of safety and security, which eludes us mostly where we grow up in the housing schemes. And I remember, you know, the walk up past the Greggs, up to where the Notre Dame Centre was, and just thinking, look how lush this place is and how interesting and expressive people are just walking down the street, and everyone dresses differently, and there's like loads of fruit shops and florists, and the place just smells and feels different, right? Just had a different kind of cultural temperature from what I was used to. And that, in a way, kind of primed me, I think, to that was one of the things that I looked forward to, was just that break, seeing a different kind of environment, because it really struck me at first. I was like, I thought Glasgow was just one city and it was all the same. How are people here living like this? And that was all part of the experience of coming to see you. This campaign is primarily focused on trauma and exploring it from different angles and facets. So the first thing I want to do is just for you to give us a working definition of trauma.
Well, trauma or traumatic experiences are events that would be upsetting to nearly everyone, and that involves a reaction of fear, helplessness or terror. And examples of that would be, well, what's going on now? Wars, you know, nature, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, where there's a mass of people involved, and everybody watching the telly and would be able to empathise and say, oh, that's a really traumatic experience for these people. And that's all very well, but that's not what most people's experience of trauma is. Most people, like in everyday life that experience trauma, like the young people that came to Notre Dame or the people I saw in schools, they had what Francine Shapira called small T's. And these small T's were just disappointments, even, that to somebody else would say, what you bothered about that for? But for the child, it was something huge. Like if they never got to the cinema and they were getting, their granny was taking them like once a year and the granny couldn't go, that would be traumatic for them. You know, these kind of things that everybody else would say, that's nothing. So these were the small T's. Things like hospital trauma. I had so many young people that were traumatised by hospital procedures. And then that really shaped their behaviour because they were held down, needles were stuck in them. And then I thought, well, if you think of it from the child's point of view, you're being attacked and their mothers are holding them down. And I had a lot of children that were very angry towards very nice mothers that were just doing their best. And when they came later on and I went over their history, they would say, I said, oh, well, that's it. There's the initial trauma there. And they couldn't believe it. And then when we started to talk about it, even though this is years later, you could see the look on the child's face of, horror and terror. And obviously that is what it is, and that's what you need to process.
So it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's my understanding of trauma is at a physical level. I remember coming into sessions and it was beginning with descriptions of things in my body. There was tingling in certain parts of my body, and there was this kind of like burning sensation in the chest. And then it's a bit like anxiety in the sense of you can just be in an anxious state, but the mind is trying to understand why or what it's about. And in that rush to make meaning of what can actually just be a bodily reaction, then we take on stories about what's going on. And my story at the time was primarily related around my relationship with my mother. Growing up, she came from an alcoholic home, thus I grew up in an alcoholic home for the early years of my life. There were lots of like incidents that were so bizarre that even people who work with people with trauma would have been like, "Wow, man, that is a bit mental." Do you know, like, credit to her, she was very original in some of the crazy shit that she managed to pull off. But really at that time, I was beginning to run with a narrative about my mother, about how much I meant to her or how little I meant to her. And that was something that's something that has to get looked at as well, doesn't it? But the trauma's not the memory, the trauma's not the story, is it? The trauma's the nervous system's reaction to what happened.
Exactly. Well, that's why, the trauma therapy that I used with you was different from other trauma type therapies or counselling, because basically you don't talk a trauma, you experience it. It's a multisensory experience. Sights, sound, smells are all kind of locked in when you've been traumatised. And that's why unprocessed trauma can be triggered at any time by a sound, a smell, somebody saying the wrong word to you, and then that triggers the trauma, because unprocessed trauma is in your working memory, like your right brain, every day. So your past is in your present when you're traumatised. And that's why it's lurking there and it comes up to bother you. And no matter how much you try and push it down, it eventually is looking for answers.
Yeah, and I remember at the time, I was in a relationship at the time. It was my first girlfriend, really, who I had ended up with quite quickly after my mother passed away. And some of the stuff that I would come in the sessions to talk about, maybe before we got into the deeper work of the EMDR, which I'll get more of an elaborate description of that from you later, but we were talking about the dynamics of this relationship, and I had a lot of insecurity. She had a lot of trauma or things going on, and so this was creating nightmarish circumstances for my nervous system, because the trauma from earlier was being kind of stoked in grief and pain. So it was this really kind of hellish time, but I felt so helpless because I thought, I just need to get attached to someone and this is going to make me feel better, when actually it was like a form of torture.
Well, that was a logical approach, because you've got a very logical, incisive mind. And so that makes sense from your point of view, and getting to know you, that's how you would think. But in fact, if you're with other traumatised people, they can then re-traumatise you. And that is what often happens with people. They think, oh, I've sorted that, I spoke about that. But when somebody then starts touching on similar things, they start feeling these feelings again, because it's your body that holds the trauma. And in my training, the trauma training, the EMDR, the psychologist kept saying, it's the body that holds the score. And that is so true. Even when folks say, no, I don't, if they look hard enough, they will find, like you see, a tingling, something in their body, often in their neck, their gut, because your gut and your brain are connected, your vagus nerve, it's all going on in there, like trains going back and forward.
Yeah, and the problem with the problem with trauma, like, is my understanding of it physically, is that there have been instances where it's functioned as an alarm system, where the pulse of the bodily expression of it has been so powerful and overwhelming that it's alerted me to something before I've even began to think about what's occurred. And it could be, as I was talking in a previous episode, an innocuous piece of information being disclosed that's actually a clue to something bigger, that links to the trauma, abandonment, betrayal, all of that sort of stuff. These are when I've had big bodily reactions. And I don't just mean back then. The wounds from back then that we were looking at, there have been instances throughout the course of my adulthood in relationships where that has been triggered at a deep level, and I've experienced, violent shaking, and even bouts of physical illness that's had to be investigated by doctors and stuff, because it's like I just feel like I've become inflamed, But as many times as that instinct is correct, it can be wrong, and that's what really inhibits people in life, isn't it? If they aren't working on the trauma or processing it physically, that they can begin to live a more constrained life because they want to minimise their exposure to things that might wrongly alert the trauma. Is that right? They don't think about it like that,
no,
but
that's exactly what they do at an unconscious level. They think, I can't. It's avoidance, fear avoidance. An example is somebody that had a road traffic accident through the Clyde Tunnel, this client. She could not go through the Clyde Tunnel. She went all the way over the Kingston Bridge, even though where she wanted to go, she lived in Govan, right, White Inch, she went all the way in her car because this person who was drunk went into the back of her. She had a child in the back. And 2 sessions, she could go through the Clyde Tunnel again. So that was a one-off trauma that was stuck there, and in her mind she thought, every time I go through there I'm going to get bumped, which of course is irrational, but that's how her mind worked. And until we did the EMDR with her, she was going to continue to do that. So you're right, people do this avoidance strategy and it just affects their lives.
And this means avoidance of anything. So if the trauma comes from a relationship or a certain kind of branch of your family, or a certain activity like driving through a tunnel or whatever, then you begin to sort of think, you walk around that. But I think there's a brilliant metaphor in that story you told, that you will take a highly impractical, long way around what should be a relatively simple thing in order to protect yourself from re-experiencing that difficulty.
Well, that's right. And that's the whole point of trauma. When it revisits you, you re-experience it. It's not a memory. The memory is after you've processed the trauma, you can remember what happened, but you don't have all these emotions attached to it. And that's what the good thing is about EMDR, because that's exactly what it does in therapy. You can then talk about it, and it's not troubling you. Yeah.
Now let's talk about EMDR briefly, just for the benefit of people who have not already Googled it to see what it means. So this was the primary treatment that we did in our sessions, and it involved.
Well, it's a form of psychotherapy, and it's used to treat PTSD, and that started. This is Francine Shapiro in the States and California in the 80s. And she discovered it quite by accident. She was given some negative information that made her feel anxious. She's walking through the park. It's a windy day. She notices the leaves on the trees. And she actually, because she didn't want to think about the horrible thing. And she's looking at them. When she gets to the end of the park, she thought, I feel better. So then she explored it, in more detail about the eye movements, moving your eyes back and forth. Practiced, I think, with friends or other psychologists, and realised that she was onto something that could help some people process trauma. And then she got in touch with Vietnam War veterans who hadn't slept for 20 years, all of that, and found it very successful, and so developed a protocol, and it went from there. And how I got trained in EMDR was after Dunblane and the shootings at Dunblane. My husband was involved in that. He was a psychologist in that area. And one of the psychologists, there's a humanitarian aid programme that they operate, and because of the trauma of that of Dunblane, they sent this guy over, Roger Solomon, clinical psychologist, and he trained a whole lot of educational psychologists, and that was in 1998, and that's when I first learned about EMDR. And basically, it helps these stored memories to be processed so that they go from your right brain to your left brain and to your long-term memory. But you remember them, but they're not bothering you. And even some really horrendous, because these kids at Dunblane that were in that hall, it was unbelievable, the changes in them, because they couldn't go anywhere. They were terrified, as you could imagine.
To be so young.
To be so young
that brutality.
5 and see that. And, they had to sleep in their mother's bed. They only felt safe in a car where they were moving about so nobody could get them. All of that. And gradually, my husband, because at first we thought, what, waving your fingers? Oh, this is a bit wacky. Mm-hmm. But it worked.
Yeah.
And it's just grown from there throughout Britain, well, throughout the world now, which is fantastic. And they still have the humanitarian aid programme. They go to Pakistan. I know somebody's worked with the Yazidi people, girls who have been horrendously abused in camps. So, yeah, there's a lot of really good work using the EMDR and training people, health professionals in their own country to use it.
Yeah, and like many forms of treatment, there are people who are more for it, and there are some people who might be more for a different form of treatment. But I can say from my experience that the treatment was effective for me. And also it really began a process of what my wife would probably say of therapizing me, right? People who don't do therapy, they don't like people who've done therapy because they always feel that they've got an advantage of them in an argument, right? Or some insight. So it's therapy speak, it's called. But it was really when these kind of concepts, words like mantra and things like that would come in, because I remember we used to do, we would basically create a safe space. It wasn't necessarily called that in the same way that it's meant now, but ultimately it was a place in my mind that at the time I considered safe, the safest place. Subsequently, you'll be glad to know it turned out that safe space, he was also a bastard as well, it turned out.
Oh, right. So it wasn't
I may need to dive back in and get a new safe place, right?
Definitely.
There was probably a bit of trauma there, but it turned at the time, this was a real solid person in my life who provided a lot of emotional, material support, and was just like a hero to me, And so that gave me a refuge in the mind. And then what we would just do is talk through the memory. So, say it's something that's gone on with my mother, a bad day where there's been some kind of original but terrifying incident, right? And we just talk through that. And then we chose to go with the hand tapping, wasn't it, rather than the eyes? Yeah,
because some people, when doing the eye movements, myself included when I was practicing, made my eyes water. Somebody thought I was crying, but it was just my eyes couldn't cope with that. So I always liked the hand taps. And with younger children, just because their visual field is not as well developed as when you're an adult, I always did tapping with children, or they tapped me, because if somebody taps you, you're giving them the control. And a lot of trauma is about you're not in control. And so that's why for young children to tap an adult, and I used to make them do it really hard and say they're not doing, and they loved that, tapping my fingers. And you could see them relaxing. I could see them processing it, and it would take seconds, whereas adults with lots of trauma, and then they've got all other stuff that they've tried to, obliterate it. It's much harder. It could be much longer to get to the crux of the matter, because they've used other things, like they've used substances, alcohol, drugs, because that's what trauma makes you do. You can't bear it, and so you think, I'll just have a drink, or I'll have this, or I'll have that. Prescribed drugs, antidepressants, all of these things, but that does only mask it. Whereas the EMDR can actually, once and for all, help the person process it, and it doesn't come back to bite you.
Yeah.
And that's the brilliant thing about...
Yeah, I guess when you're choosing a form of treatment, any professional's always weighing up the pros and the cons and the risks. But it's interesting because a lot of the non-medical forms of treatment get stigmatised by pushers of the other types of treatment.
Yep.
And so it creates a kind of difficult environment for people who suspect they have a mental health issue going on. There is a lack of access to public health services that could provide the expertise. And so we also have this eruption of online language around trauma, a new lexicon. I think trauma was the #1 searched term in 2021 on Google.
Really?
Trauma is being used increasingly in a colloquial way, similar to how people would say, "Oh, I'm addicted to buying shoes," or I'm feeling a bit depressed. You know, it's gone that way from the clinical to the colloquial. Now, my interest in that is this: as we have a kind of parallel situations where you have a collapse of provision of public health services and an eruption of unregulated online therapy, where you're going into the situation and you don't really have much insight about the world you're stepping into. I wanted to talk for a bit about what the risks are, and because there is a mass culture of self-diagnosis currently occurring around trauma, because people experience pain, fear, all of the stuff that we've described. What are the risks if we're wrong, either about having trauma or not thinking we've got it when we do, or of misdiagnosing one form of trauma and not another? It's a minefield, isn't it?
It is a minefield, and you're right about professionals, because there are arguments going on. I mean, CBT is the other, trauma-focused CBT is the other big therapy that goes along with the EMDR in terms of treating trauma. And even amongst health professionals, especially in the States now, the CBT lobby is huge. And so that diminishes the EMDR, in spite of the fact that we know through lots of clinical trials that EMDR works. I mean, it's not just a fad, it's been researched. NICE have accepted it as a bona fide therapy, as well as trauma-focused CBT. And it's just a shame that there's not enough people out there to be doing it, although there's more people being trained, throughout the UK. I mean, there's quite a healthy EMDR group, and with, there's 5,000 members that have signed up to the association, of regular conferences. There's been more development of the basic protocol, because it's an 8-step protocol that Francine Shapiro devised about having always start with a safe place in somebody's head, because if you go into the trauma and they've not told you everything, and they might not, because not out of badness, but because their brain won't allow it to go until you're in there, and then you can see them being re-traumatised. You can go into that safe place and bring them out of the trauma. So that's why it's dangerous for people to muck about in sort of quasi-psychological therapies that they can do over a weekend.
Yeah. This is what I want to get to.
It's unregulated, and it should be regulated, because it's so dangerous, because people can have then a psychotic episode where they completely break down.
Yeah.
If you've got somebody like that, punting bits. I mean, there are people that are punting bits of EMDR that's not EMDR, and they're not trained. And it's about making money out of folk.
Yeah.
Which is a shame.
And we're also in a place where good ideas and bad ideas can be disseminated so quickly. And one of the reasons I set out to do this campaign, even though it's a wee bit kind of a pivot from the previous work that I have done, is because my own experience of trauma as someone who has been treated for it, and someone who has spoken about it, and someone who has written and disclosed things publicly. Now, one of the key features of what I refer to as kind of online trauma discourse, which I differentiate completely from any clinical context, this is something that's got a life of its own, that's governed by the perverse incentives and mechanics of social media conglomerates. where the incentive is to upload content that's titillating and controversial, even if there is a health risk attached to it. And so my experience is there are risks with disclosing trauma publicly. But just now, right at the core of this is the idea you should just blurt it all out. You should blurt it all out and you're going to get closure and catharsis, and you're going to feel like your trauma has been upcycled to mean something. When in actual fact, the minute that you put it into the public square, if your trauma's still active, you're 100% reopening that wound. In this cultural environment, I have no doubt about that.
No, that I would 100% agree with you. And disclosure without, you know, a therapist or safety there is really bad news for the person. Because as you see in social media, you know, people making comments, you're doubly traumatised and you've got nowhere to go with that. And I think that can drive people into things, suicidal thoughts. Well, it has driven people.
Rehab. That's where I ended up in rehab. Because what happened with me was, you know, it was a contributing factor. Obviously, I'm an alcoholic, so I'm always slowly heading towards rehab if I'm not doing all the right things. But I underestimated some of the directions from which the bullets would come, having disclosed certain things. I underestimated the level of interest in the traumatic descriptions because I thought I'd written a book that was more kind of about social commentary. But then it was seen, that was stuff that was seized on, so I was kind of blindsided by that. Then I was blindsided by the impact on my family, wider family who I hadn't spoken to in years. You know, relatives, my mother's family, the few that are still alive, who you know, don't just have different memories for whatever reason, but actively dispute things that I've said and believe that I've made stuff up for money. It's a really painful thing to go through, and you begin to doubt yourself. You know, I do. I mean, I will always hear someone out to the detriment of my own perspective. I'll think, well, maybe they are right. You know, if I'm being mistreated by someone, there's a part of me that goes, maybe I do deserve this, you know? And so it's...
But that, can I just interrupt? But that's because of your early life experience with your mum and the lack, you know, you had a disorganised attachment to her. So what that does for children is they don't have confidence in themselves because nobody's saying to them, or very few people, or your mother are not saying, oh, you're doing great, son, this is brilliant. You know, they're not giving you that feeling of that you're worthwhile. So when you meet somebody else like that as a grown up and you've not had that, you know, your foundations of your life are shaky and chaotic like yours were, then you're going to have that self-doubt.
Yeah.
You know, because that confidence is just not there.
And this, whatever the trauma has been in the kind of interpersonal, familial sense that we're touching on and that I'm touching on in the campaign, public disclosure without prior insight, guidance, maybe consultation with relatives, not just to protect yourself, but to make them aware. Are you comfortable with me sharing this aspect of my life? Because it's not just my story, it's also yours. You might have a different recollection of it. You might not feel comfortable with it being told. But there is, and I believe the kind of capitalist ethos has contaminated the sanctity of this idea of disclosure. Disclosure has to be done at an appropriate level. It has to be done in an appropriate time frame, and certain prior conditions have to be met before it occurs. And this idea that just blurting it all out impulsively is going to heal you. People think that sharing the story brings the closure. They've forgotten that the idea of sharing isn't just to broadcast your version of it. It's to get other eyes on it and get insight and maybe even feedback about your interpretation of it. Because while there are certain things that happened in my life I remember so vividly, I can't imagine why anyone else would remember them differently. The mind is an interesting thing, and there's all sorts of things that go on. And if you're not in a good place to have something that you've integrated into your identity challenged on a fundamental level, then don't talk about it in public.
No, definitely not. And there's these plethoras of programs where people are, you know, disclosing all sorts of things, like, you know, your Oprah Winfrey type things. And I can't remember the guys. I didn't, because I thought, I can't look at these. people, and I'd be shouting at the TV saying, no, they shouldn't be telling all these people these really personal things, because like you say, they think, oh well, that'll make me feel good. No, after the event they feel bad, because it's putting it out there, but nobody's putting it back. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's scattered, but nobody's putting the pieces back in the right order. And that's where therapy comes in. You disclosed stuff to me. It was confidential. I had the skills through my training to be able to help you to put it together, and also, to move these very traumatic, when they were very traumatic memories, into another space in your mind so that they weren't troubling you anymore. And of course, stuff will always come up, but the fact that you can have a safe space that you can use when you're not seeing the therapist, and that you can use that is the way to go. Yeah. And especially for young children with trauma, the narrative, giving them a narrative that they can give up their old behaviours when they're in a new situation is extremely powerful. I mean, once I learned that technique, I didn't use it with teenagers, but with younger children who'd been traumatised, ill-treated, what have you, doing a narrative with them about, like a fairy story, not using their name, but then you can see they're identifying, that's me. And they would look excited. And then you could introduce the fact that, well, that part of the story of their life, they can give that up now. Mm-hmm. They don't have to behave badly. They're safe in their foster placement or wherever they are, that this new situation is rock solid, and therefore they can give up these old behaviours of biting, spitting, wetting the bed, whatever it is. And like magic, they stop doing it. Mm-hmm. And to get that at that younger age is amazing, because then it doesn't affect the other bits of their life. If then they go on to have a very positive, home situation, then, all that past stuff when they were younger just kind of disappears. And it's quite miraculous.
And I can attest to that. I can attest to that, because it wasn't long after our first phase of sessions completed and I had moved into supported accommodation where I was on my own, because it was kind of felt by you that the residential instability I was experiencing was kind of increasing the risk of other things happening. And so that was a period of stability. But then, which I believe was the kind of time bomb that was always ticking anyway, either genetically, culturally, or cause of trauma, or maybe all three, I then began to rely on alcohol. I then began to rely on drugs and experimentation really in the beginning, but it got its claws in me pretty quickly. And one of the features of addiction is that it will spin any narrative and any story in order to conceal itself behind anything else, because it wants to be the last thing that gets looked at when a person's saying they have problems. And so this left me in a place where subsequent interactions with services were more complicated, because I had less insight into what the truth was. Mm-hmm. My narrative was all scrambled based on which version of myself I wanted to present in which context. And I was also suffering often from withdrawal, from mood and mind altering substances when I'd present at mental health services, saying I could hear voices, saying I was crippling anxiety, sometimes just writing down how I felt because I couldn't speak. And then this is when the medical stuff started getting dispensed. And it was really difficult, I guess, for medical professionals at that time, before the drug crisis has started and we really see an explosion in prescription drugs in our society, to really understand and be able to go, what is this person actually dealing with? What comes first? Is the addiction causing the mental health issue? Is the mental health issue causing the addiction? Where is the trauma and all of that? Mm-hmm. It's really complicated, and I think a lot of people, they'll choose whatever narrative is easiest for them because there's things they don't want to confront.
Well, that's really true. But because you were a teenager, I mean, you had so much stuff going on because you lost your mother and you had a complicated relationship with her. And, young people who lose a parent in teenage years, I mean, there's huge risks for them of ending up in prison. The drug addiction, suicide, it's such a vulnerable time because, as you know, your hormones and your brain changes, you know, until you get into being a grown up. And so when any of these things happen out of the run-of-the-mill things, then it's going to have a huge impact on you, and it clearly did for you. And as I say, teenagers do experiment anyway, you know, with alcohol and drugs and smoking and all these things because it's cool, you know, and you want to be in with a crowd and all of that kind of thing. But for somebody that's had a difficult background like you, it's kind of lethal in terms of trying to get out of it. It's like you're a little down into these depths of...
Yeah, and it was only, you know, 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, when, you know, my first serious attempt at sobriety began. And this last 10 years has been the most stable period of my life. And even with all the usual difficulties that life throws at you.
And why did you decide, that's interesting for me because I wasn't seeing you then, why did you decide, you know, like I've had enough and what made you?
It was one Christmas, it was just a Christmas from hell. And, you know, for various reasons, I was in a different relationship and I was experiencing a lot of those feelings that I would get. And not being able to articulate myself clearly and not being able to trust my own instincts and thinking, no, this is my insecurity and all of that sort of stuff. And it probably was a mix of both, just a bad dynamic, and there was a lot of drinking going on. So anyway, I went through a breakup and not one that I initiated. And then I just had a pity party all Christmas and New Year. But it came to the point where the only people who were around me were the other problematic drinkers. And I was sitting waiting to go to the off sales one morning with my carry out that somehow I could never make last until 10 o'clock. And I got a random article sent to me from a Facebook follower from the United States. And it was one of these kind of American straight shooting for the hip, get your shit together kind of articles, right? Now, it probably wasn't very kind of like it wouldn't clear the bar for being like medically qualified advice. But it was the first time anybody had said it and honest to me in months, because I was so vulnerable, so delicate, so closed off from reality that created a paradox of vulnerability where I need people to get around me, but they're all scared to tell me the truth. And this is another part of this trauma culture, which is affirm only. Affirm every impulse we have, affirm every version of events that we have, as well as don't challenge a person with trauma's perception, either of themselves, of the events, or their life going forward, the narratives. And I see a danger in that because I see this massive interest in understanding the language of trauma, but also it creates this kind of ego around it where it's like, I have trauma, so I cannot be challenged. I cannot be guided. I operate from my narrative, and if you challenge me, you re-traumatise me. And I think if I hadn't had people like yourself or other mentors or milestones in my development in life who had a rapport with me that was sufficient to say things like, maybe that girl that you're with isn't, you know, you might love her, but Darren, come on, I mean, she sounds a bit mental, you know, and that was back then. That was back then. If I hadn't had people doing that, you know, my life I would have just been operating from trauma non-stop.
But normally, under normal circumstances, if you'd been in a family where you were nurtured and cared for, your mum or your dad would have been saying that to you, because my mum and dad said that to me when I was a teenager and I was in the 60s about, you're not doing that. You're not wearing that green eyeshadow because you just look like, you know, that was the worst you could do, you know, go out with that, and be back in at 11 o'clock on the dot. You know, there's the lack of boundaries and rules that I think is making young people, like, they don't know where they are, who they are, and how to behave, because there's this lack of boundary. Like, you can go out all night clubbing, and whereas when I was young, there was 11 o'clock, everything shut down. Well, 10 o'clock, the pub shut down. If you went to 11 o'clock, so you had to go back and go to your bed because, you know, that's what everybody did. But it gave you this stability even though you were going through the normal sort of adolescent angst of like, I hate myself and I'm not good enough and I'm not good looking and I'm not this and I'm not that, because everybody was going through that the same, and there was these rules, and you just, you abide by the rules. And I don't think there are these rules now. I think the rules are all being muddied and fuzzy, and children and young people still need these rules. And I think since the pandemic, I mean, I know a lot of teachers, and theirs is saying it's chaos in schools because the kids, because they had a couple of years sitting in front of screens, video games, don't get me started on them, about what that does to your brain, and all this, getting yourself all excited about all these things jumping about on the screen.
That's a very technical description of a video game there.
I know, you can see I'm a real techno whiz, not. But that used to drive me mad when folk would come in, because they were watching things that were out. Once it's out, the genie's out the bottle. You can't put it back in. And I think that's a huge problem with young people, pornography, everything.
Affirming, really, saying, if you want to do this, you can and should do it. And I guess that is, again, a sort of offshoot of, it's a very consumerised mindset. Because when you have freedom, but you don't know how to operate within that freedom, then you do just become a slave to impulse.
You do.
The final thing I wanted to ask you, this has been, for me, a great discussion, is... if I had told you back then that I had planned... maybe I did, I don't know. I had planned to write a book where I was going to talk about the things that I talked to you about in those sessions. What would your advice have been to me then?
What, you were going to write a book about it? Mm-hmm. I would have been surprised. I wouldn't have been shocked, because remember when we did the ending, because unfortunately you had to move on because of your age. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wanted to keep you because...
I wanted to stay. There's just a cut-off point where it's just like I'm turning up with a beard and my own kid.
Exactly. You think, we can't do that anymore. We can't kid on, you're 12. So, at that point, we closed down the sessions that you'd said, and we always do the ending bit for EMDR is the positive future scenario. And as I said to you, right, you will make up a little narrative about what you would like to do in the future in 5-10 years, and then I would talk about it in the narrative, and then I would do the tapping, and I'm saying, now that's it installed. You don't even have to think about it. And it's all the things that you're doing, because you said you wanted to be in the media, that you wanted to have a family, have children, and that's why, when you asked me that question before, I thought, well, you're doing it. Yeah. That to me is like, I thought, that's great. Yeah. This works. It's an unconscious thing that you put in, embed in somebody's head, and they just go towards it. Yeah. And that's what you did. So you're a perfect example of, for that piece of work, it worked, and the positive future worked for you as well. Yeah. And so, I would have said, I wasn't surprised.
It's mad because when I cast my mind back to that time, not just the time with you, but the time generally, it seemed so chaotic. I think, how did I survive all that? There was just so many moving parts to it. But now in my life, I still feel it's chaotic, and I look back at that the way kind of Limmy looks at the photo of Millport. It's like there's a simplicity, and so there's I guess there's that's just the human condition, isn't it? You always kind of want to be where you aren't in a sort of way, don't you? And there's just something about kind of learning. Maybe that next slave to impulse decision isn't going to bring that thing that you're looking for. Maybe you've got to learn how to just sit where you are and see what you've got. I hope you guys who are watching this have enjoyed the discussion. I've had a great time. It's lovely to see you again. Yeah, I've enjoyed it as well. Oh, good. That's always a bonus. In the meantime, I'm sure you guys are already filling the comments up with your valuable insights or abuse, whatever. We'll take it all. Give us a like, give us a share, give us a little subscribe, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks very much.